So here's our little instance document that we get that validates against that XML schema we just took a long look at. And as you can see, it's pretty simple. It's got a declaration at the top, a person name element as the root, and it has an attribute, as well as 5 elements inside of it. So how do we know? Well, we do kind of know because we just spent a long time going through the schema. But let's review. So here's the person name element. Well, how do we know what that's all about? Because the schema says, hey, we have an element called person name and it's of type person name type. And, well, how do we know what goes in something that's a person name type? Well, again, we go to the schema that said, hey, we have a complex type called person name type, and it had these 5 elements inside of it. Boom, 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 boom. Prefix given, middle, sir, and suffix name, and they're all strings, da-da-da. And it also had this attribute called person name code. So cool, that's how we know what person name looks like. That's how we know it has an attribute called person name code. That's how we know that it has 5 elements inside of it with the names that we see there, name, prefix, given, middle, da-da-da. And that's how we know that they're all strings from that chunk of the schema. So, okay, we know the person name contains all these different things. How do we know what each one of these guys inside of it looks like? You know, we've got this person name prefix. What do we know about that? Well, again, we can focus on just that part of the schema. Now, we did see it in the previous slide as part of that long list in the sequence tags, but here it is, just the part for person name prefix. It's an element. It's called person name prefix. It's a string, and it has a min occurs of 0, so it's optional, but we used it here in the instance document, but it still would have validated if we'd left this tag out. And since max occurs isn't listed, it defaults to 1. So that's how we know what person name prefix looks like, and that's how we know how many of them we can find inside a person name. Now the same is true for the next 4 elements, and I could highlight each one of those, but there's very little point. They're all pretty much the same. Here's an element, here's its name, here's its type, a string in each of these cases, and then here's the cardinality, the minimum number of times it can occur and the maximum times it can occur. So, and that's true for all 5 of those. The only thing that leaves now is the attribute. So how do we know what the attribute looks like? Well, we just look at that part in the schema. And there's a whole section defining this attribute. And you see it there highlighted now, the name, person name code, so it's the name of the attribute. Whether or not it's optional, in this case we're making the use optional. Does it have a default value? Yeah, it's got a default value of real name, so if we left it out, which we can do because it's optional, it would still take the name real, or the value real name. But if we want to know what else can go in there, we need to look at it further on its typing. It's not just a string. Instead, it's a string that's been restricted to 3 potential values, real name, alias, and birth name. So that's what we know what the attribute looks like and whether or not it needs to be in there in the person name tag. So now it's time for an exercise on XML schema. The way this exercise works is that I'm going to show you a chunk of schema on the next slide, and you're going to need to answer the following questions. First, list the root elements. How many are there and which ones are they? Number 2, list the elements which are of complex type, any of the complex types. There may be more than one in the schema. We don't know. We haven't seen it yet. List the elements which are of simple type. And then finally, list the attributes in the schema. So this is an exercise in looking through the schema and pulling out the different pieces. Now I'll repeat these 4 questions on the slide with the schema, and you can pause after I ask each one and try to figure out what the answer is. So here we go. So here is the chunk of schema. I'm going to ask each of the questions in turn and pause for a sec, giving you time to pause the video and answer the question for yourself. Again, please do the exercise. Don't cheat yourself. You don't gain any benefit from not doing the exercises. They're really important. So here we go. First of all, list the root elements. How many are there and which ones are they? Now list the elements which are of a complex type. Remember, there might be more than one. And now list the elements which are of simple type, and simple types are things like strings, numbers, booleans, things like that. And finally, go through and list the attributes that are in this schema. And if you've done all that, let's move on to the solutions. Okay, time for some solutions. The first question, root elements, how many are there? And the answer is 1, person. There's always just one root element. Now, if you're the overly clever sort, you may be saying, well, no, the root element of the schema itself is schema. And yes, you'd be technically correct. The question really is, what root element is being defined by the schema? So technically, yeah, the schema element is the root element of that schema. The root element being defined for instance documents that would validate against the schema is person. And there's always just one root element in an instance document. But you know, when we start working with the NIEM, we'll find that the NIEM schema doesn't define just one root element, because the NIEM schemas aren't designed to actually validate as a whole in an instance document. Instead, it's actually more of a toolbox or a set of parts that you take and build an exchange with, and then you define your own root element. So the answer here, it's defining just one root element, and that element is person. So which elements are of complex type? Well, there's two of them. There's the person element itself and the person name element. Those are both of complex types. They're defined to hold other elements inside of themselves. So which elements are of simple type in that schema? Well, person given name is defined there as a string, person surname is defined as a string, and person U.S. citizenship indicator is there defined as a Boolean. Those are all simple types. So those are the three: person given name, person surname, and person U.S. citizenship indicator. And then finally, list the attributes. And there's only one attribute defined in this schema. It's person name comment text. It's pretty easy to find because it's got the word attribute in front of it. So those are the answers. Hopefully they're the same ones you came up with. If you came up with different ones, go back and take a look at that schema and see why you came up with what you did.